Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and I'm going to take this opportunity to let you all know if you're watching us on YouTube, you can also listen to us if you'd rather. You can get us where all fine podcasts are found on Amazon Music, on Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and elsewhere. And if you are listening to us on one of those platforms, you can also watch us on YouTube. This week's episode, I'm very excited to bring our guest on. I know I say this quite a bit, but I am truly excited to bring this guest on. It's someone I've known for a very long time. You're gonna see me fanboy, to say the least. His name is Bob Levey, and Bob Levey's had a storied career in and around Washington, D.C. He was a columnist for the Washington Post, Bob Levey's Washington, a mainstay of daily reading in Washington. He was a host on WMAL, a news talk station here in Washington, where I occasionally will fill in nowadays, and I was an avid listener to Bob's show. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. He came to D.C. from, I believe, Bob, what is it, the University of Chicago?
Not directly, but yes. There was an intervening year where I was a cub reporter in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Wow. So Bob went from New York, and Bob and I share the same high school alma mater, the Fieldston School, the Ethical Culture Fieldston School, and I want to talk about that too. But my point, Bob, we seem to have a theme. You're the second University of Chicago alumnus we've had on the show. The first was Professor Paul Post. Actually, he teaches there. He's not an alumnus, but nevertheless, it's all good. He's been the author of many books. He's, as I said, received awards. He was a Washingtonian of the Year for Washingtonian Magazine. We're going to get to his book, Larry Felder, Candidate. But Bob, I want to start here, and again, not to get too political. I want to steer clear of the individual politics necessarily. But you came to Washington during the Johnson administration, which I find very hard to believe, but nevertheless, it's apparently true. At least that's what your bio says. In the intervening 50 odd years, and boy, have they been some odd years, especially recently, how has Washington changed from your perspective?
Well, Andrew, let me first of all clear up that I came here during the Lyndon Johnson administration.
Thank you.
Yes. I know my hair gives me away here, but Andrew and I were never kissing buddies. We just were not in the same era.
Yeah.
How has Washington changed? My gosh, you don't have enough time for me to get deep into that answer, but yeah. I think in three major ways. One, the local city is now a much more cosmopolitan place than it ever was when I got here. Two, the role of Congress has completely changed. Congress used to be, because the Constitution says it should be, the dominant force in Washington, D.C., and today, I don't know what you would say about Congress that would be positive, but I can't think of one single thing to say about Congress that is positive. They are neuter, they are neutral, or else they are at the extremes, and they don't get anything done.
You know, Bob, before you get to number three, I want to talk about that for a second, because I remember I had a meeting up on Capitol Hill. This is 15 years ago. I was working for the National Federation of Independent Business, and my focus was on the executive branch and administrative power, the issues there. And you know, I had a congressman ask me whose fault it was that the executive branch had so much power, and I'm very skeptical of executive branch power. And I said, well, frankly, Congressman, it's your fault. And he seemed taken aback by this. And I said, because there is all of these disincentives to Congress being very specific in their legislation. And when you give up on your legislative powers, nature abhors a vacuum. The executive branch is going to step in there and fill it. I think you and I would be in agreement on this.
100% right. Yeah. And part of the reason there too, Andrew, and I will get to number three in a minute, is that I think the voters and the business community around the country really don't like our constitutional model. They want the president to be the CEO of the country, which he is not. Take a look at what his powers are and are not, and you will see that he has more unchecked power in the international arena than he ever does anywhere in the legislative or the local arena. But people can't accept that. They say, Biden, why don't you fix this? Biden, why don't you fix that? Trump, why don't you fix this? And it's just not the way our system works.
Right. It's the you know, when Obama said, I've got a phone and a pen, and you know, I'm not afraid to use them.
Right.
But it's one of those situations where, regardless, right? This is one of those areas. I wrote an op-ed back in 2016, being a Trump skeptic along with my colleague Jerry Rogers from Real Clear Policy. And I said, the only upside at the time, this is 2016, the only upside to a possible Trump presidency is that maybe Republicans and Democrats in Congress can come together and rein in some of this power, right? If they're so afraid of somebody like a Donald Trump. And then, of course, reality hit, and it's a reality that I should have understood, which is both sides want that executive branch to have that power so that when they're in power, they have that power. I mean, am I wrong here?
You're right here, and you are right regardless of which party is in power and which party is not.
Yeah. So let's talk about number three. I'm sorry I rudely interrupted you.
Number three is the international arena, of course, and Washington is world famous for this. If I can go back some 200 years, Andrew, one of my favorite Washington stories has to do with the ambassador of France, who came to Washington in the early 19th centuries and immediately petitioned his home government for hazard pay because he was serving in this desperately underfunded world capital called Washington, where the streets were not paved, where there was mud on Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, I'll leave it to you to come up with a metaphor for mud on Pennsylvania Avenue today, but we're talking about literal mud. And today the international community has proliferated. There are many more nations. And I would also say 3A, if I might, Andrew, that
please.
The international community is a little less influential with our government than it once was. There's a lot of make nice diplomatic receptions around town. That will always happen. And most of that is all about getting caterers rich. I don't think it actually achieves very much in terms of world peace or world influence.
Yeah, it's interesting because we talk about the issue of people doing things to satisfy the cocktail circuit as opposed to sort of the principled issues, right? It's in the movie Almost Famous, they talk about rock and roll becoming an industry of cool. That's kind of what Washington is like. It's funny because when I first came here, and I came here 30 years ago, and I liken Washington, D.C. to almost like a small state capital. Like there were, if you knew people, if you didn't know somebody, chances were you knew somebody who did. I don't think it's quite that way anymore. Let me ask you this though: do you still get a little misty-eyed when you're downtown? You see the monuments, you see the Capitol. I mean, I know I still get that way.
I definitely get that way, in part because I get a lot of dust in my eyes when I walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. That makes me misty-eyed every time.
Sure,
but
yes.
I believe in this country. I believe in our Constitution. I believe in our system. And what I don't believe in are people who refuse to understand it, who refuse to learn it, and who think they can bend it to their will. And they're all over the place.
That's certainly that's very true. So let's sort of talk about this. So you start off, you go to Albuquerque, then you come to D.C. Let's talk about Bob Levey's Washington. This column, I mean, that again, I'm reminded of the line, right? From the famous film All the President's Men. A lot of it filmed at the Washington Post, in which they're going through, the editors are talking about the stories of the day, and there's some, throwaway fun little story, and Jason Robards, as Ben Bradley says, well, it's the one story everybody's going to read. Your column was the one thing that I think everybody in D.C. read. Talk about that. Talk about doing a daily column.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think that I am living proof. I think I'm still living after writing 5,411 columns on deadline across nearly 25 years. I am living proof that anybody can do anything if they drink enough coffee.
Sure.
That truly was my raison d'etre and my success. I could never have done it without energy burst. I could never have done it without a lot of help and without a lot of ideas. But I also could never have done it if there were not a Bob Levey's Washington to write about.
Sure.
Even here, certainly out in the country and out in the world, people think, oh, Washington's just this theme park, and the only thing that ever happens here is the federal government. I wrote all of those columns based on the idea that there was a there, there was a there here, and that it was a local there here. And so the column, people say, well, what was your column about? Well, it was about Muzak and elevators on K Street, but never about what they talked about in the law firms on K Street.
Sure.
My column was about parking tickets. My column was about love in the office. My column was about schools. My column was about the famous athletic rivalries between two local high schools. Funny story, if I may, Andrew.
Please, of course.
When I was all of 23 years old, the Washington Post sent me to cover the Johnson White House on weekends. And I thought I was pretty snazzy stuff, man. 23 years old, I'm covering the most important person in the world. I hated it. All they do is coop you up in the East Wing, and you never can talk to anybody. You have no sources. You have no access. That's not what journalism is. And so after 4 months, I asked off of that beat, and Bradley gave me a look that I will never forget. And he said, there's only one story in this town, man. And I said, well, I don't agree, and I think I'm going to go and find a lot of them in local Washington, and I did.
And you proved Ben Bradley wrong, which is no small feat, mind you.
No small feat, and I don't think I ever did again. But hey, I'll take one. I'll take one.
Yes, and a career-defining one. I mean, let's talk about that for a second, because it's not just that Washington has changed. And again, you were never in charge of the Washington Post editorial board or its thrust. But let's also talk about the change in journalism, right? Because I think you have that situation in which the 23-year-old wants to be that weekend White House correspondent, and doesn't care that they're, getting cooped up in the East Wing just so they have the stature. Talk about that. Talk about the hard work that goes into it and how things might have changed.
Well, this is always going to be an industry for hard workers, Andrew, and hard work, definitely. It was then, it still is today, maybe even more so today because of the electronics, where today's White House correspondent is not just filing one story to one newspaper at the end of the day. He's tweeting all day long. He's on radio and television. He's like... if I can be a captive of my generation,
please.
He's like one of those old folk singers in the 60s who would come out with an acoustic guitar, but also a mouth rack so he could play the harmonica.
Sure.
And also he'd have a set of drums at his feet, and he'd do all of these things at the same time. That's what journalism is today, for better or worse.
But and we're going to talk about this because Bob's also done some part-time professional folk singing. We got to chat about that as well. But let me ask you this, because one of my concerns is what we now call the 24-second news cycle,
right?
And the inability of anybody to be able to digest the news, the drive for the hottest of the hot takes, and owning your opponents, which is. As journalists, I don't think you're supposed to do that. You're not supposed to have opponents if you're a journalist, except for folks who want to hide the truth. And so talk about that, though, and how that can be problematic.
This is the most complicated business problem I have ever seen. Yeah. Because look at, on the one side, Andrew, we have more educated people in our world than ever before. We have more discerning people than ever before. We have people who really do understand, if you get them alone and you start talking a little bit, that the truth is not simple. That deep journalism is where you're going to learn the truth. And to get deep journalism and to read and listen to deep journalism, it takes time. And what happens here in our culture more and more is that nobody thinks that anything that takes time is worth anything. That if you can't get it in 280 characters, or you can't get it in a soundbite, or you can't get it in a comment underneath a news story, that it's worth nothing. And in fact, the opposite is true. The deeper journalism, I think, is as good as it's ever been, probably better than it's ever been. And it's in some ways dying on the vine because of the economics of the profession.
Yeah, don't stop there, Bob, because I want you to talk about this, because we could talk about the death of local news, and that's news aggregators like Federal Newswire are trying to fill in and provide some of those news stories. But this is an issue, and I want to dovetail it into, reporters not asking the tough questions of, again, folks that they see as allies, but only asking the tough questions of their opponents. We've got to get beyond that to get answers to substantive answers to things from those folks who are doing the thought leading.
We've got to get beyond it, but we also have to have people on the other side of this transaction, Andrew, who understand that journalism is not rained down on this unsuspecting population from 30,000 feet. It's like those horror movies we saw when we were kids. People look up at the sky and say, "Oh my God." That's not what journalism is. Journalism is a deal between the journalist and the consumer. And if people don't want deeper journalism, they aren't going to get it. And if the market does not support deep journalism, we are going to live in a world of headlines and in a world of the kind of distortion that you just pointed out.
Well, and this is a perfect segue into talking about the work that you did on WMAL, because I was a listener. I'm not just a talk radio host, but I've also been a consumer of talk radio. And I'm going to say this, Bob, again, not to blow smoke at you or kiss your posterior, but when I've done my talk radio shows, I think back to the shows that I would listen to that you would do, which were deeper than the normal sort of, again, shortcuts to reason. Deep thinking, asking good questions, taking all kinds of phone calls from listeners and having substantive discussions. Talk about that, and again, not necessarily how talk radio has changed, because I think we know how that's happened, but talk about how you approached your radio work.
I thought that talk radio was the perfect town square. I still think it could be, where you welcome anybody in with anything to say, and you, the host, don't set yourself up as God Almighty or an oracle or the only source of truth. You get on the air and you say, "Hi there, folks. For the next couple of hours, we're going to have a roundtable discussion about this and that." And Andrew, what I always said on every one of my radio shows was this: if you're not careful, you might learn something.
I love that. It's the corollary to that is what Jerry and I both talk about. And I know I constantly talk about my buddy Jerry. He and I have worked together in both policy and media for almost 20 years now. But you have to be able to be persuadable. If you want to persuade, you have to open yourself up to being persuadable. And actually, let me dovetail that into the classical Fieldston education. And because I know you're doing a lot of work, and we'll get into that as well. But one of the things that I talk about with students, from Fieldston, is that the great lesson I learned, two great lessons I learned from being a Fieldston student, was that and by the way, I'm wearing my Fieldston tie, wearing the Fieldston orange on my pocket square. That to be skeptical, right? To not just believe something that somebody's telling you, and also to listen actively, to be an active listener. Was that the same for you? I mean, do you think that, or what are the other benefits?
It was, but the third thing I would add to that, if I can put a third log on the fire, is that what I learned at Fieldston was that if you have this fabulous early education, and we both did, Andrew, and hundreds of others had, that I really believe it's our responsibility not just to chase the almighty dollar and pleasure every second, but to turn ourselves outward facing to try to help the world in some way. And I've tried to do that in my way, and I know you have in yours. And the good news, I think, for old fossils like me is that, I'm still in touch with a lot of my classmates, and the good news is they're all still alive. But the rest of the good news is that we all share that feeling. We are doing socially conscious stuff, and I don't mean by that it's all woke or it's all one party or anything like that. But we're serving on local boards. We're helping old ladies across the street. We're doing what needs to be done. And I really do think that I did learn that at Fieldston.
It's funny because as I was saying to you, I had the opportunity to speak to a group of Fieldston students a couple of weeks ago. And the issue of not just active listening, but coming into conversations without presuppositions about people, about what they believe. And the issue of because when you presuppose, when you prejudge what somebody believes, it immediately puts them on the defensive. The walls go up, and you can't have a discussion. We have to have those discussions without those prejudged positions, don't we?
We do, and we also have to stop pigeonholing people and,
right.
and just reducing them to, oh, you're blue, oh, you're red.
Right.
People are very complicated creatures. You may have noticed that. And
yes.
And the fact that they are complicated should be respected.
Well, and the other part of it, of course, is we have these complex problems that need to be solved in the world. There's no denying that. I mean, we can disagree on whether or not something is a problem or something isn't a problem, but there are problems that we can agree on. And even on aspects of problems that we might agree on, we have to be able to have discussions. I just had a conversation with somebody about free speech. If you shut down the other side and say that something's already decided, you can't have those discussions. You can't find solutions, can you?
No, and very timely of you to mention that, because just yesterday I was in an airport with a guy, and he took a look at me. This happens to me a lot. When I'm flying back to Washington, people look at my hair and they say, "Are you a senator?" And I deny it, but then they want to talk to me anyway. See,
sure.
And this guy says to me, "Are you worried about America?" And we're sitting in the departure lounge in the New Orleans airport, and I said,
"Wow.
Yeah, I'm worried about America. I'm very worried about the First Amendment. I'm very worried about freedom of speech. I'm very worried that people cannot speak their minds on college campuses. I'm very, very worried about the way freedom of the press is distorted for various other purposes."
Sure.
And if anything is going to sink the country, Andrew, and I'm not a prophet of doom here at all, it's going to be the erosion of those two freedoms.
It's funny because anyway, I'm reminded of a conversation I just had with somebody about this. One of a dark moment. My own college alma mater, the College of William and Mary, a few years back, they had an event where the ACLU of Virginia was coming to talk about how students could help illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants, however you want to call it. And the ACLU event was shut down by anti-ACLU protesters because of this. I'm astounded that we are now living in an era in which the ACLU is being attacked for defending free speech. This is what you're talking about, isn't it?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. And you could substitute either side of the political equation and have the same point, and you would be just as right if you did that. It's really dangerous, and free speech means free. And yes. I tell my students, for example, Andrew, about the First Amendment, and they say, "Oh, well, that means you can publish anything you want." And it does not mean that.
Yeah.
It does not mean that. And responsible press is necessary, and edited press is necessary. But the First Amendment is so widely misunderstood, and it's so widely misapplied that we're going to get in trouble here.
It's a situation in which folks don't recognize that the so-called standard, which isn't a standard at all, of you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, that was used to justify silencing an anti-war protester.
That's exactly right.
And yet you have folks who should be lions of this principle, going out there. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Anyway. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bob.
But then you look at the most amazing invention of our lives, the internet.
Right.
And there are no guardrails. There is nobody filtering. There is nobody censoring. Anybody can say anything. I don't know if you've ever talked to a lawyer, Andrew, about whether you could collect a cent from somebody who gets libeled or slandered on the internet. You can't. You can't.
Absolutely.
So it's this free fire zone of anything goes. And, a lot of people would say, okay, cool, that's great. That's what freedom means. I'm much less sure of that. I think the internet is, I always say it's like a raging river after a big rainstorm, and here comes a tree stump, and here comes some mud, and here comes a washing machine, and then look, there's a flower. Once in a while there's something good in all of this wild freedom, but just as often there is something bad.
My again, to quote my colleague Jerry Rogers, who uses the phrase ordered liberty, which I get a little uneasy about because I think that can be abused. But it's Well, I think it was Mark Twain who said, or maybe it was either Mark Twain or Harry S. Truman who said, "A lie travels halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its pants."
Yeah, I don't remember who said it. One of them.
So it's interesting in that regard. So let's actually, I'm sorry, let's move on a little bit. Let's talk about some of your other work, because you are an author. You've written a book that I now have to read, and I'm sorry, Bob, I haven't read it yet. But Larry Felder, Candidate, was published before the pandemic, yes. Thankfully. Would you let's start here? Do you think you'd take a different tack if you'd written it after the pandemic?
Oh no, not at all, because it's a novel, Andrew. This is not
yes.
the ultimate journalist reporting, but it's a book about my twin passions, politics and journalism.
Yeah.
And the plot is really very simple. Larry Felder is a famous Washington newspaper columnist who abandons journalism to run for Congress in the suburbs of Washington.
Okay.
And I'm not going to give it away, but all kinds of stuff happens to poor Larry. Love happens, and corruption happens, and the unexpected happens, and he falls afoul of those nasty meat eaters known as newspaper reporters.
Sure.
But the good guys win in the end.
That's good.
And I want to reassure you and everybody listening that I am not Larry, and Larry is not me. I would never abandon journalism. I would never run for Congress or for anything else. I'm either too smart or too dumb.
It's interesting. You know, it's the corollary here. Just to sort of go back to what we were talking about in terms of legislative power and executive branch power. And a lot of folks don't recognize that the more power you give these people, you know, I was going to use, let's say, a person of undetermined parentage, the more power you give them, you know, the more opportunity for corruption there is. We seem to also forget that when you have governments that can pick, you know, winners and losers, that's where the stakes get so big that people are willing to go and bribe a congressman or bribe a regulator. I'm sorry, talk a little bit about that.
Or not even bribe them, just take them to a fancy dinner, or support their campaigns, or give money to their PACs, or do all of the things that are not only legal, but that are everyday occurrences in our politics.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm saying, Andrew, yes, I am, that money corrupts absolutely, and that it absolutely has corrupted our system.
I mean, you and I may disagree on this. But it's the issue. At least we have to have the conversation about it, and the degree, and not sort of go back and. Actually, let me come back to this, because you talked about the internet a minute ago, and I agree with you. We've never been a smarter globe. We've never had as great an access to information as we do at our fingertips. And I know you say you're not a smartphone, cell phone guy, but we have this thing at our fingertips, and yet we've never been, I don't think, as dumb as we are. It's really Dickensian. It's the best of times and the worst of times. It was the age of knowledge. It was the age of ignorance.
It is absolutely Dickensian at the same moment.
Yes.
You can have great things on the internet and terrible things on the internet, as you say, at a flick of a finger. And I lie in bed at night and I say, is this a net good thing? And I really can't tell you the answer.
And then we go down the road of algorithms, you know, and the thing that I'm sort of looking at today, I'm trying to figure out, for instance, Bob, why it is that on a particular social media platform, I will get one post from a friend of mine, and then I'll get, you know, maybe a post from a group, and I'll get something suggested, and then I'll get a couple of ads, and then I'll get another post from somebody that I actually want to look at. And the problem, of course, is we're all being stovepiped, and that stovepiping prevents us from having conversations with each other. And, you know, it all becomes this vicious cycle, doesn't it?
Not only vicious in that way, but I just have to say, this is a little off the point, but I think the preponderance of social media has led to a kind of social stunting that goes beyond what you just said.
Sure.
The most amazing news story I have read in the last 6 months, just get a grip on this.
Okay.
New York Times reports that 15-year-old boys no longer know how to ask a girl for a date.
Yes.
Because they can't do it.
Right.
They ask her by text message,
right.
Andrew.
Yes.
Well, I'm not going to say I was the most successful 15-year-old asker of dates in the history of the world, but hey, man, I would march up to the girl and say, do you want to go to the dance with me? I wasn't going to use some machine to do it. What has happened to this world?
Bob, it is the end result of the proto version of what you just said, going up and asking, which is to send somebody a note that says, do you like me, yes or no? Click the box, which is what you do when you're like in fourth grade.
Right.
It's funny because I've got two girls who are, both in college now. And we talked about this when they were in high school and the stunting of the socialization, COVID and the lockdowns. And again, not to debate the politics of that, but we have noticed that the longer that a kid was in lockdown, the less of their ability once they got to college to be able to socialize with others. I mean, I'm deeply, deeply troubled by, Bob, and I'm sure you are as well.
And you should be in many ways, not just because it'll mean that there are fewer dates on Saturday night, but I think this carries over into the business world. It certainly carries over into the political world. My gosh, I watched the January 6 hearings, and every single one of those staff members behind the congressman had their faces buried in a phone the whole time. Why don't they listen to what's going on?
Well, and the other part of it, right, which is that all of this stuff is then geared, as you just said, towards the 240 character or less crowd, and it's all about scoring political hit points. It's not about having actual discussions and going down that road. Well, and I appreciate that. So you were just up. So I saw you up at Fieldston in October at Fieldston Homecoming.
Yep.
You guys were making a presentation. Talk to us about that. I know that that's a very parochial thing, but I love this story though because it is really good stuff.
In June, we had our 60th reunion, and you may now say that I don't look that old, but you'd be wrong. And at the 60th reunion, one of our classmates, who is a world-famous sculptor, said that he really wanted to give a gift to the school of a sculpture that connoted Fieldston, that honored Fieldston, and that would live forever on the Fieldston campus.
Yeah.
And the only problem was we needed to raise the money to cast it and his time and blah, blah, blah. And he named a number that we needed to raise, and the school said, we'll be glad to do this if you can raise the money. And yours truly said, okay, I am now in charge of the fundraising committee.
Wow.
And I'm happy to report to you, Andrew, that we raised this money that was 2 digits, a comma, and then 3 zeros.
Nice.
We raised this money in 4 days.
Wow.
So let's hear about no school spirit anymore.
Yeah.
Let's hear about old people just want to play shuffleboard. Forget it, man. We really felt it about Fieldston and about this sculpture, which shows a dog with a book in his hand.
Yeah.
The sculpture is called The Reading Dog, and it's now on the campus right in front of the library.
Right in front of the library, the Tate Library, and I'm gonna say this, folks, because I may get a little choked up here. So I came back to Fieldston for a homecoming, and it was a spur of the moment thing, and brought my wife for her. She'd never been to Fieldston homecoming before, and I don't know if I told you this, Bob, but it was a scheduling fluke. So we thought that the football game was starting at X. It turns out that the football game was starting 2 hours later. So we showed up 2 hours early, and we're walking around campus, and so I see a group of folks out in front of the campus library. And I walk up and I listen and watch the presentation, and there's this form dean who was now the head of school, and there I see this gentleman, like, oh my God, it's Bob Levey. Now Bob and I had met a handful of times at some alumni things, and Bob, when the presentation was done and we're all sort of milling about, Bob made a beeline for me, and said, "Oh my God, Andrew, I thought that was you." And Bob, I got to tell you, I was incredibly touched by that. I mean, because you and I have had interactions, but the fact that you came over, that meant I will say that meant a great deal.
And it meant a great deal that, as they say on the airlines, that you would have chosen to spend that portion of your day with us. Yeah. You didn't have to come and listen to a bunch of old people congratulating each other, but you did, and that was impressive.
Well, it's again, because it's that sort of spirit that winds its way through everything with this school. So let's talk about some of the other stuff, Bob. Normally I'm going to get to the outside interests because I'm sure there are other outside interests here. Bob, one of the things, actually, I'll pitch this to you, but don't steal the idea. So I, at one point, was contemplating a show called Outside Interests. And the idea was to interview folks in the political and policy world, but having nothing to do with politics and policy, to talk only about the stuff that they do outside of these things. Because to me, I think we need to humanize people more. Again, it gets back to what DC used to be about, where people would be able to bond over things other than their political tribalism. Because there's a Senate staffer that I know who's a guitar player, or a policy public affairs person who's an avid photographer. Folks who are chefs. I do a competitive barbecue with my brothers. And I think there's merit to this. We're going to get to the folk singing in a second, but actually, no, let's start here, then we'll get to the other outside interests. Talk a little bit about the part-time professional folk singing.
Well, I'd be glad to. I came along at the same time as a guy you may have heard of, Andrew, named Bob Dylan.
Sure.
He captivated the world in the early 1960s, and I've got all of his records. You remember records. And,
of course.
And
listen, hold on for a second. Bob, this past year was the first year in 20 years that vinyl actually outsold CDs. So
really?
Vinyl is back in a big way, yeah.
Well, maybe there's some hope for the world then. But
yes.
So I would listen to Bob Dylan and I would say, if this guy is making $1 zillion with a voice that's that bad, sure, and I've got a voice that's this good, I should be doing it too. So I get to Chicago and I find this place with a bare brick wall in the back, and they have an open mic night, and you can sit on a stool and with your guitar and play your deathless ballads, and they'll pay you in French fries and beer, and I did that for several months. And when I say, Andrew, on my resume that I'm a semi-professional folk singer, it means that I should have gotten paid for it and never did.
There you go. All right, I like that. That's good. So were you amongst the crowd that was very angry when Dylan plugged in, or were you cool with Dylan plugging in?
I was cool-ish with him plugging in because of a very basic reason. When you play an acoustic guitar, you better play it pretty loud, or anybody who's more than 12 feet away from you cannot hear it.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I guess I think on balance, the plug-in was good.
So other influences. So I'm a huge Joni Mitchell fan. Again, maybe it's the Fields Tonight in me. Joni Mitchell having a huge resurgence right now. Brandi Carlile recording her stuff. She's doing a concert in June. I can't go. I would give anything to go. Joni, Neil Young. I mean, the Byrds. I mean, where do you come down? One of my great favorite interviews that I've done, Chris Hillman from the Byrds, wanted to interview David Crosby, never got a chance. Still want to interview Graham Nash, but folks like that?
Folks like that, and the guy that I have never interviewed and wanted to play like, and in my weaker moments wanted to be like, was Chris Christopherson.
Very nice.
Chris Christopherson's rendition of me and Bobby McGee.
Sure.
I can still sing it in the shower. I do sing it in the shower. Sorry, no guests are welcome in the shower with me, but that song still does it to me 60 years later.
Who are you listening to on a daily basis? For me, not a day goes by that I'm not listening to Joni Mitchell. Not a day goes by I'm not listening to the Kinks. How about you?
I don't have a specific roster. Songs will pop into my head at 3 a.m.
Oh my God!
And I always keep a notebook beside my bed, and I'll write down something. And I just the other day got fixated on this song. I hadn't heard it in 30 years, and it's a song about the suicide of Vincent van Gogh. Done by a guy named Don McLean.
Sure, of course.
And the song
Starry Night.
Yeah, and the song is actually called Vincent. But
yes.
Wow, what a song. Wow.
It's funny. So it's a habit, and my wife and I were just talking about it over the weekend because it drives her up the wall when I do this. And I do it more now that I don't have kids in the house. But I will wake up with an earworm in my head, some song that I'm thinking about. And I will go downstairs and feed the dog, and the first thing I will do is I will put on Alexa. I will say, Alexa, play this song.
Every time. But, don't laugh at me, but
no.
It took me years to discover that I could be doing one thing on the computer and open up another browser at the same time and listen to music at the same. I mean, that's how much of an out-of-it guy I am. But that's often how I do things. I will listen to Starry, Starry Night when I'm writing.
So one of the greatest dangers that I did, or worst things that I did, was when I taught my dad how to start putting stuff on his Amazon Echo, because my dad is older than you or Bob by quite a bit, a decade or so.
Okay.
And so his taste run more into the 40s. And some he'll put on Spike Jones and his City Slickers.
If you want me to sing Sinatra, I Saw a Man Who Danced with His Wife, I can do it, man. I can do it.
It's funny because that's Sinatra. Anyway, Sinatra just popped up. So beyond the folk singing, beyond the writing, I mean, what else are you occupying? You were just down in New Orleans. What else is occupying your time these days?
Well, what I was down in New Orleans with is what has occupied my time for many, many decades, and that is the card game bridge.
Oh, that's right. Yes, of course.
I am a national champion bridge player. I write about bridge. I teach bridge. And I was in New Orleans at the national championships.
And how'd you do?
You really had to ask. You really had to ask. I think I've just answered that.
There you go. Excellent. Well, congratulations. That's excellent.
No, don't congratulate me. Pity me.
I see. Just the opposite.
Dry the tears.
Yes. Well, I'm sorry to hear. It's interesting because there are more people who are starting to play bridge now again, I think. Because I know sort of it was my parents' generation, my dad and my mom, my aunts and uncles, they would play avidly every time they would get together, and I would sort of poo-poo it. Now I'm regretting that I never got into it because I think I've missed out. I think you would agree that I've missed out on it.
I think you have. I'm not sure that more people are playing it now than ever. I think the heyday...
Not than ever. I think more people are starting to play it now than have been in recent decades.
I do think that boomers who are retiring sit around the breakfast table the first day they're not working anymore, and they look at each other and they say, "Hey, dear, you remember when we used to play bridge in the student union 50 years ago?" And they're coming back to the game.
Yeah, listen, we it's funny we're now empty nesters, and for me it was my wife saying, "Okay, now we gotta find some ways to fill our time." My wife thinking that we weren't going to find ways to fill our time, which is crazy. But yeah, so it was the kayaking and camping. I love camping, so it's it is. Well, Bob, listen. So how do folks find out more about the work that you're doing? How do folks find the book?
I appreciate that. I have my own sales website for the book, and people are encouraged to go there and to tell all 10,000 of their closest friends to go there. The site is bobleveypublishing.com. That's bobleveypublishing.com.
And that's Levey, L-E-V-E-Y, to be really clear.
E-Y, L-E-V-E-Y. Yes. And you can find out all about the book there, order the book there, and to some degree there you can find out what I'm up to. But the best way to find out what I'm up to is just to take one of my classes at Politics and Prose Bookstore, or to just find me via Bob Levey Publishing, and I'll be glad to fill you in on the other stuff.
Listen, Bob, this is, again, I haven't been able to interview Graham Nash. I never was able to interview David Crosby. But the fact that I was able to sit down and have this conversation with you is a rare treat. Thank you so very much for sitting down with me today.
Thank you so much. A pleasure, and all the best to you and your family.
And thank you all for tuning in. This has been another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.